is, again, a topic that I'm very passionate about. I teach a course to sophomore honors students in the Gatton College every fall about intercultural business communication. And so I've taken a lot of the topics from that class and sort of rolled them into this conversation. As Dolores was saying, there are a couple of opportunities here where I hope folks will become involved, use the chat, that kind of thing. And I hope that we can make this as interactive as possible. I have a lot of topics I want to try to discuss with everyone, and just 60 minutes to do it in. So I will go ahead and get rolling with this. So just to start off, give you an overall idea of what we're looking at, I wanted to talk about some tools that are related to intercultural communication and understanding, and take a look at the theories and concepts that underpin those, see if we can try to apply those to the world that we're working in here on campus, and make sure that I give you those resources so that you can take those back with you and give you some tools that you can utilize in your everyday work life or personal life. So the first thing that I wanted to talk about, and you're probably going to wonder why the heck I'm introducing the concept of a stereotype at the beginning of this conversation, because stereotypes are generally conceived of as bad. And stereotypes definitely are not ideal. But there's an idea that sort of comes out of the research on intercultural communication, and there have been models that have been developed to look at sort of cultural tendencies across a broad variety of cultures. And those models are what we would refer to actually as a sophisticated stereotype, meaning that they are underpinned with research, but they are still generalizations in the same way that stereotypes that we are familiar with are generalizations. So is that good? Is that bad? Why are we doing this? The idea that I want you to take away from that is that that sophisticated stereotype does have that sort of research foundation, but I also want you to understand that it has its limitations too. It's not a manual for how to interact in every situation, but the models that we'll look at can be ways of starting an understanding about different cultures so that you can interact with them a little bit more appropriately and respectfully. One of the researchers that we'll be talking about is a woman named Erin Meyer. She wrote a book called The Culture Map. And in this book, she actually talks about a situation where she's speaking to a group of people. And one of the readers actually that was interacting with this, I guess it wasn't a speech, I think an article that she wrote, was interacting with this and said, you know, instead of talking about culture, it's important to judge people as individuals and not just products of their environment. And I think it's valuable to understand sort of the truth in that statement, but also to understand the response that she has to that, which is if you go into every interaction assuming that culture doesn't matter, your default mechanism will be to view others through your own cultural lens and to judge or misjudge them accordingly. So that's why I want to present these different models for understanding intercultural communication, because they give you a way of not just disregarding culture, but they give you kind of a starting point for understanding it so that you can interact with it, different cultures more respectfully. So today what I wanted to do was cover kind of three main tools and theories, and that all go into the concept of understanding culture and interacting with different cultures. First, we'll look at Michelle Gelfand's theory of tight and loose cultures. Then we will take a look at a social psychologist model. His name is Vertovsteda, and he has 6 cultural dimensions that we'll take a look at. Meyer's The Culture Map that I just mentioned. So Michelle Gelfand wrote a book recently called Rule Makers, Rule Breakers, Tight and Loose Cultures and the Secret Signals That Direct Our Lives. So she has this concept of a tight culture versus a loose culture. The idea of a tight culture is a culture that has more rules, social norms, and regulations that will control people's behaviors. A loose culture has fewer of those. By and large, for example, the United States tends towards the loose end of that spectrum. An example of this would be, let's say, in pre or hopefully very soon post-COVID times, you go to a basketball game. We all like basketball. And you're feeling a little squirrely that day, and you decide you're going to put on your favorite top hat, black tie, and tails. People might look at you a little strangely if you walk into a basketball game with a tuxedo on, but you're not going to be like thrown out, right? You've perhaps broken a cultural norm, but it's not one that is going to get you in trouble. Whereas there are cultures in the world where, for example, chewing bubblegum is illegal. And if you go to Singapore and you spit your gum out on the sidewalk, you can face some very harsh penalties for something like that. That is, by comparison, a considerably more tight culture. So I don't know if anyone here has a guess as to whether you might be on the tight end of the spectrum or the loose end of the spectrum, but feel free to sort of pop any ideas you might have about that into the chat. We will keep an eye on those, but as you're thinking about that, trying to put that into context, I want to present that kind of tight, loose element in a slightly more playful way. So if you're thinking of tight, loose, another way to think of it is, which Muppet? Are you a Cookie Monster or are you a Kermit the Frog? Now, please tell me that you know who the Muppets are, because some of my students were like, who's that? And it broke my heart just a little bit. But what I mean by this, and what Gelfen sort of posits about this in her book, is there are order Muppets, like Kermit the Frog. They're a little bit more, they have a tighter mindset. It involves paying more attention to these sorts of social norms, a strong desire to avoid mistakes, more impulse control, and a preference for order and structure. Whereas a chaos Muppet, the Cookie Monster Muppet, is much more loose in terms of mindset, a little less attentive to those social norms, more willing to take risks, a little bit more impulsive, and more comfortable with disorder or ambiguity. A lot of us have been forced into dealing with the chaos Muppet side of things because we've all been forced to deal with ambiguity this year, but probably some of us are dealing with that a little bit better than others. And so our order Muppet sides might be struggling with this, whereas our chaos Muppet sides might be dealing with it a little bit more fluidly. So again, if you have thoughts about that, feel free to pop it in the chat, but I want to give you another way, and we can kind of actually do this here together. Dolores, I might need your help here in terms of sharing that, what is that? That URL. But I wanted to give everyone actually just a couple minutes to take a quick survey that Michelle Gelfen put together in terms of understanding your own mindset. Where are you on this spectrum?
And I did put it in the chat.
Okay, great. I cannot see the chat right now, so if you guys can, fantastic. And what I would like to ask is that everyone here just take a moment, open up a browser window, pop that URL in there, and I'll just give you a couple minutes to take that test. Or that quiz. It's 20 questions long. It's very quick, and it can just kind of give you an idea of where you are in terms of that tight, loose mindset. So as you finish that, if you are comfortable sharing where you are on that spectrum, I'd love to see kind of where people fall. I can tell you I fall on the moderately tight side of that spectrum. Considering actually even within the US, there are different regions tend to fall on different sides of that. And so based on where I'm from, I'm not surprised that I have a moderately tight mindset. As folks are finishing up, I'm seeing we actually have a moderately tight Kermit over here. I love it. We have a variety, actually. We've hit all 4 of the possible categories already, I think. But we've got people from, you know, moderate, or at least 3 of the 4, moderately loose, moderately tight, very tight. Some people are very unsurprised by their results. So what I like about this tool, aside from just the interactivity of it, is it can kind of just put a little bit of your own um, thoughts and feelings about yourself into some kind of context, which is sort of helpful to understand not only how you interact with the world, but how you then are also interacting with others in different circumstances. And while I'm thinking of it, I'm going to share a link into the chat also. This is a link to a podcast that Michelle Gelfand did with Shankar Vedantam for Hidden Brain. So if you want later on just a nice podcast to listen to about this topic, it's one I'm not kidding you. I think I've listened to it 5 times just because I really enjoy the conversation that they have and the little bit more depth that Michelle Gelfand can go into on the topic in a 45-minute podcast that is only about that. So save that if this is a topic that interests you or something that you have found intriguing. So, all right, so we did have a variety of results on this, and I hinted that different parts of the country, even within the US, sort of tend towards different parts of this. So, for example, the southern parts of the United States and the Midwestern parts of the United States tend to be a little bit more someone's upset that they're on the very loose. I don't think this is necessarily bad. We need people on the loose end of the spectrum so that those of us on the tighter end of the spectrum don't get too wound up. So I want to make sure that everyone understands there's no bad answer. There's no bad result. We need our loose friends and our tight friends to be able to do different things, that's going to help us out a lot in our world. But as I was saying, different parts of the country tend towards different sides of this. So I'm originally from the Midwest, from Kansas, and Kansas, the Midwest, and the South tend a little bit more towards the tighter end of the spectrum. Whereas, for example, like New England and New York, they tend to be a little bit looser. Some of the things that I have found very interesting about this concept of tight-loose is also that sometimes cultures that are more on the loose end of the spectrum can be perceived as a little bit more rude sometimes, whereas cultures on the tighter end of the spectrum are frequently perceived as more friendly. And it took me a little bit to kind of wrap my mind around that. Why? Because in my head, it seems like it should be reversed. Wouldn't looser cultures somehow be more accepting or something? And yes, sometimes I think they are more accepting, but because there are fewer norms that people feel that they have to obey, I think it's easier to perhaps, make a remark and you're not really worried about the impact of it, or there's no kind of social norm or structure that says, no, you must behave this way. Whereas in other parts of the country where those social norms are perhaps a little stronger, they come off as more friendly. Because one must obey those particular rules so as not to be misperceived or thought of as being rude, for example. It's a bigger deal to come across that way. So I wonder actually, sort of in looking at this and thinking about it, if anyone has any immediate reactions to how you feel about this or what this I don't know, when you got your result, what did that make you feel? And again, as far as I'm concerned, feel free to unmute yourself for a moment or drop something in the chat. At this point, Dolores, I can't see the chat anymore, so you may have to read out some of the responses for me.
One person posted that they're from New York. And surprising that New York would be looser. They really feel like their environment has made them the tight mindset.
Yeah. Well, I think there's a lot of things that play into this. And I think it can just, again, and this is part of why I started it with this idea that these are generalizations. So they are definitely not perfect reflections of every individual and every member of that culture. But it does kind of make you sit there and think like, whoa, why did why do I react this way based on that culture that I was brought up in? And how does that impact me? Are there any other immediate thoughts there in the chat?
One of them I think is kind of funny. It says, being in HR, I feel like I need to be moderately tight.
Yes, and that's a very good point, because actually there are different, career paths that are going to sort of lend themselves to one side of this spectrum or the other. I think HR, you have to be detail oriented, right? You need to have a little tighter mindset, because that's a really good way to be more successful. An accountant, a lawyer, a physician is probably more likely to be a little bit on that tighter side of the scale than perhaps an artist would be. I know those are kind of maybe stereotypical generalizations. I was, as Dolores mentioned, my bachelor's degree is in theater. I love the arts. I love being creative, but I actually found that there was a lack of structure that bothered me. And so I ended up making a career shift into something that had a lot more structure, and I'm happier in it. And so I think that that is actually a reflection of the fact that even though I value and love these really creative things, I really value some structure and some solid foundations, and that became more important to me. And that's probably based on my own personality, is perhaps not surprising that I wanted to make a change into something with a little bit more structure. So we'll keep going here, but I guess I challenge you on any of the things that we're talking about today to think, how does this apply to your work life or your personal life? How does this apply to how you interact with your colleagues or students? And what does that potentially look like? And how might you kind of change then how you're interacting, or do you? And just, it's like I said, it's a tool that can help hopefully put things into some perspective. So the next one that I want to talk about is the model that Vertovsteda put together. Vertovsteda, as I said, is a social psychologist who did a tremendous amount of work on cultural research. And so he defines culture as the collective programming of the mind, almost as if culture is sort of the software to the hardware of our brains, which I think is a fascinating way to conceive of culture. And it makes sense to me in the concept of when I think about going into different cultural environments and how that structure, that programming is so inherent and so knit into how we process our worlds. So he has 6 different, what he calls dimensions of culture. I've listed all 6 of them out here, but what I wanted to do was concentrate on just 3 of these today in our conversation. The 3 are collectivism versus individualism, a concept called power distance, and one called uncertainty avoidance. So individualism versus collectivism has to do with the degree to which people in a society are integrated into groups. So for individualistic societies, ties are a little looser between these groups. People are expected to look after themselves, so their immediate family, they're a little bit more I-centric. The United States, when it comes to sort of how these different countries are scored, is one of the most individualistic societies in the world. Collectivist cultures, by contrast, are much more integrated into strong, cohesive groups. They are going to look out for the and protect that group unit. They are loyal to that group, and as the cultures tend to be much more we-centric. And so it can be very interesting when someone from an individualistic society interacts with someone from a collectivist one, because they perceive different things very differently. So for example, one of the more collectivistic cultures in the world is China. I have a lot of Chinese students that I work with, and in those interactions, I can really see the differences in, even like in the classroom environment, where the grade you earn is your own grade. You are the one who creates that. You're the one who sort of decides on what that looks like. Well, when you come from a culture where you support each other a lot, some of those those boundaries between support and even sort of an inappropriate level of support become blurred when it's appropriate from the culture you come from to support everyone in that group. And so it can really conflict, for example, in these kind of academic environments where students are doing what they always did at home because that was how you supported that group that you were a part of, versus this American culture where people are expected to just do it on their own and nothing else is acceptable. So we can see this reflected in a lot of the work that we do on our campus. Power distance is the extent to which the less powerful members of organizations or institutions accept and expect that power is distributed unequally. So with high power distance, there is a lot of sort of hierarchy. You don't question authority, whereas lower power distance countries, authority can be questioned. That is acceptable and all right. And I'll talk some more and give some more examples again about how I see these reflected in the work that I do, and definitely seek to see how you all see it as well. The last one that I wanted to hit on is called uncertainty avoidance. Uncertainty avoidance is not quite the same as risk avoidance. It deals with a society's tolerance for ambiguity and indicates to what extent a culture programs its members to feel either comfortable or uncomfortable in unstructured situations. So for high uncertainty avoidance, cultures try to really control with strict behavioral laws, rules, etc., disapproval of deviant opinions, and belief in an absolute truth, whereas low uncertainty avoidance is very much the opposite of that. So all in all, personally, I feel like I see these a lot in the work that I do, but I wanted to open this up again to folks to drop some thoughts into the chat, or even to unmute yourself and make a couple comments. Where do you feel like you see things like individualism versus collectivism, power distance, or uncertainty avoidance reflected in the work that I'm stopping sharing so I can read the chat again. So I actually have a couple of examples. I will go back and reshare my screen just to highlight some of, again, where I see some of these different characteristics in the work that I do. And I should mention that I am an academic advisor in the Gatton College, and I work predominantly with international students. But in my opinion, really all of these different cultural models that we're talking about, it's not necessarily just international intercultural communication. Like with tight loose, it can vary even throughout regions within the US or wherever you might be from. Or I saw someone who had parents who were from different parts of the country, for example, and all of those things can kind of come in and influence how we perceive and understand the world around us and the cultures that we interact with. So here is another URL. I'll ask Dolores to go ahead and share that with you. While we're not going to manipulate this a whole lot as we're speaking here together, I wanted you to have this just as a tool to explore and play with. It's really fascinating. Through the Hosta, it's called the Hosta Insights tool, and it's a way of comparing how different cultures have scored in these different dimensions, and kind of understand then, where you might find larger differences of understanding and where there might be greater potential for sort of cultural clashes or confusion or something like that. So for example, as you can see here, I've compared China and the United States because I have quite a few Chinese students that I work with. You can see I've highlighted those three areas that we just mentioned: individualism versus collectivism, a hugely different one between the United States and China. They're really at polar opposite ends of that scale. Power distance is also quite different. There's a lot more sort of deference to authority in Chinese culture, whereas the United States is a little bit more egalitarian. Not 100% by any means, but a little bit more so. And then there is a small difference with uncertainty avoidance that you'll see reflected on this particular page too. But as I mentioned, I see this reflected in terms of this particular example a lot with the students that I work with. My students there can be definitely different perceptions of how to go about doing their academic work, what is appropriate or not appropriate, and the conversations that we have around that. I definitely noticed that, for example, the Chinese students that I work with have formed really powerful tight-knit groups, which I think is so wonderful, because to be so far from home, to have a group like that that can really help support you, I think is a tremendous thing. And it's really fascinating, because if I tell one student one thing, sometimes 30 minutes later, 3 more students will ask me about the same thing. It's because they've already told one another whatever it is that we were already discussed. And sometimes I struggle with it, because I think, well, you know, what works for one student may not work for you, but they're coming from a culture where they've all perhaps done the same classes. They really might all have the same scenario walking into that particular situation. But my more individualistic mindset defaults to this: you're all individuals. I can't make a judgment based on this person that I can apply to you. I have to treat you all individually. And they're approaching that scenario from exactly the opposite direction. They're saying, you know, we've come from the same background, we've come from the same classes, everything is going to be able to be applied to us in the same way. And so that can affect and influence the kinds of conversations that we have with one another. Power distance, I also noticed this with a lot of my I'm pretty casual. I think of myself as rather informal. I tell my students to call me Summer, that's fine. And a lot of my students really struggle with that. They want to call me Dr. Eglinski, Mrs. Eglinski, Miss Summer. And I grew up in the Midwest, and like I just, it was normal for me to call my professors by their first name in most cases. And but they really struggle with sort of removing whatever that honorific is, whether it's Dr., Mrs., Miss, what have you. And I try to respect that, and you know, I'm not going to belabor the point with them or anything. But I even notice it, for example, when a student won't use my name and they call me advisor or teacher. Or merely professor or something like that. And they don't even use my name. And I think that that is that kind of respect of that power distance and that authority figure as well. Uncertainty avoidance. This one is depends on which students. You know, here I've given the example again of China, but I have students that I work with from all over the world. And I feel like a lot of times with my students, this can be reflected in a student being very anxious about, you know, what are their next steps? How do they deal with this, you know, ambiguity or the unknown? And wanting to be very specific about what those things are, and struggling to kind of relax into the process at all. So it really manifests in very different ways, I think, in all of the work that we do. And I'm sure that you've all come across this in different ways as well. I'm going to go ahead and move on just in the interest here of time, but please, if you do have questions or comments about this, save them and we'll make sure that we touch on those at the end. I'll also have my contact information, so if anyone has questions and wants to keep discussing it, I'll be very happy to do so. So the third and final area that I wanted to discuss with all of you is the information that Erin Meyer outlines in the culture map. So kind of similar to Hofstede, she looks at a number of different areas that kind of define culture. She has 8 different scales. And again, I want to take a look at 3 of those: her communication scale, her persuading scale, and her decision-making scale. Now, Erin Meyer really looked at this within the context of a business environment. So I think that still works really well in a higher education environment as well. But it is a little bit more focused on that kind of business element. So the first area being communication, the sort of poles of the scale are low context communication and high context communication. Low context communication, you can see the United States is the furthest on the end on this particular one. We are very low context, which means we are very explicit, precise, clear in how we express ourselves. We tend towards repetition to make sure that what we're trying to say is clear, and there's tends to be very little hidden meaning. Whereas high context cultures are much more sophisticated and nuanced and layered. Messages may be both spoken and unspoken, and a meaning may be more implied rather than explicitly expressed. I think a lot of us, for those of us who were raised in the United States, especially when giving, say, a presentation or writing an email or a paper, we're taught, tell everyone what you're going to talk about it, and then tell everyone what you talked about. It's this sort of sandwich of repetition and information, whereas that's so low context, it's sort of shocking. Whereas folks in other cultures might be like, well, yes, of course, I didn't need you to tell me what you're going to talk about and what you did talk about, just tell me about it. So you'll see this kind of reflected in how people react to things, how they understand things. I see it reflected with my students when I might ask a student from a higher context culture what to me is a very clear question, but they may be more accustomed to responding to that in a much more subtle way. Well, it's very difficult for me sometimes to understand that subtlety of communication. And so I can honestly struggle with that. I mean, one of my very dearest friends is from North Carolina, and I was born in Kansas, and we've kind of bemoaned the fact together that, or I have complained to him, perhaps is more to the point, that I wish people would just be clear and straight and to the point. And I think sometimes he would look at me like, but is that borderline rude, And I think that again is perhaps reflected in these different parts, different regions of our country. Where I am from, it is that extremely low context, very explicit and to the point. Whereas where he was raised, there was more subtlety of communication, and it was more nuanced. You were going to be a little bit less explicit and maybe a little bit more implied in some of that communication. So I think we see this, you will see variations across different regions of the United States, as well as, of course, across different countries in the world. And so you might see in this list of different locations, places where your students or your colleagues might come from. And maybe all of a sudden it makes sense why, when you asked your student this question, they didn't actually respond verbally. And that might be an indication of that slightly lower, or rather slightly higher context communication. It might not be that they didn't know the answer. Maybe they just felt uncomfortable saying it. And so they gave different indications, maybe more body language related, to try to respond to that question, and maybe didn't feel comfortable responding to it as explicitly as we are accustomed to here. The next one that I wanted to take a look at is her persuading scale. Now, she describes them as sort of principles first versus applications first. I prefer to kind of think of it as theory first versus facts first. So in a more principles first or theory first culture, when you're trying to persuade someone of something, whether that is in an academic, classroom presentation, or perhaps a professional presentation, you're going to start with the theory behind what it is you're trying to articulate, and then go into sort of the facts and supporting information for that. Let's see. When you, for example, are, if you were in like a language class and you were maybe studying Spanish, for example, if the teacher starts with the grammar, the vocabulary first, that's going to be more principles first. An applications first culture is going to start with facts, statements, opinions, and then back those up with that theory. So for example, in your Spanish language class, if your Spanish teacher comes in and immediately starts talking to you in Spanish, that's going to be more on that applications first side. So that's, sometimes you can see it reflected in different teaching styles. You can see it reflected in how someone might approach a presentation, whether that's like an academic presentation or a formal business related presentation, and just kind of how they're going to lay the groundwork. Either where are we, you know, sort of what's the end result we're trying to get to, and here's the background for that, or here's the background, therefore we have this end result. So again, it's that difference between kind of theory as a foundation, a place to start, versus facts and information as a place to start, then backed up by theory later on. One more element to the persuading scale, which I think, at least from an American perspective, can actually be kind of difficult to wrap your head around, is she describes that in a lot of Asian countries, instead of the results being specific to kind of theory versus facts first. So if I go back a moment, you'll see we don't see any Asian countries on this scale. And the reason for that is because she's kind of grouped them into what she calls a holistic approach. So instead of starting kind of at one end of that scale, they're really looking at the entire picture to have an understanding of this one specific thing. So one of the examples that's used there is they gave a group of Americans and a group of Japanese individuals a camera and said, take a portrait, take a picture of this person. So for the most part, the Americans took a headshot, right? Shoulders, face, that is the picture of this person. Whereas the Japanese participants took a picture of the person sitting in a chair, sitting in a room, surrounded by that environment. Because to understand that person, right, to understand what is influencing them, you have to see them within the complete context of that environment. So that, again, it can really impact how we work with our students, how we work with our colleagues, how we work if we are collaborating with colleagues at other institutions, or in a conference, then how people approach the reasoning when it comes to wanting to make a persuasive argument or wanting to give a presentation can really be strongly by these kind of cultural elements that we already have programmed into how we perceive and how we interact with the world at large. One thing that really helped me to understand this concept of holistic persuasion is it's kind of the difference from thinking macro to micro. So that's the holistic, macro, big to micro, versus a more Western perception of micro to macro, starting with the individual and then working out from there. So I think that that also reflects some of that individualistic tendency in some of the more Western cultures as well. This one, the deciding scale, I think is actually one of my absolute favorites. Here you see different ways of approaching how to make decisions. Some cultures are going to be what Erin Meyer refers to as big D decision-making cultures. So they are going to have a lot of discussion. They're going to try to explore every avenue. And then once they make that decision, that is a solid big D decision, they go into implementation. There is no more discussion. This decision is not being changed. Other cultures have a shorter period of discussion and tend to make a decision relatively quickly, little d. And then once implementation is begun, their discussion can continue. They might revisit that decision. They might even alter that decision. So big D, firm, final decision-making cultures versus little d, less firm, can be revisited cultures. Definitely, that's going to have a lot of impact on how we work with, I think, colleagues across borders and from different areas. So you can see the graphic. You have the German business person saying no, and the American business person saying no, but maybe yes. You might be able to tell here the US tends to be more on that little d decision-making side, whereas, of course, other cultures can be on the big D side. The US is right in the middle of this, actually. And so The big D and little d are kind of coupled with the poles of this scale, which go from consensual to top down. And the US is kind of floating around in the middle of this one. Some cultures are much more consensual. They're going to build consensus behind a particular decision that needs to be made, whereas other cultures top down, someone at the top is taking sort of taking on that role, making that decision, and then that decision is final with that person. And so the consensual top down versus and combined with that big D and little d, they're different kind of quadrants almost in understanding how to make decisions. To me, the consensual versus top down seems relatively apparent. You know, you've got perhaps a boss in that top down culture that's making that decision primarily versus in a consensual culture building that consensus. The part that I find really intriguing is that especially that big D versus little d decision-making cultures and how much discussion must be had ahead of time versus how much discussion can continue to have be had after that decision is made. All right, so I rocketed through that. I'm just a couple minutes ahead of where I wanted to be, but I'm going to stop sharing my screen here for a minute because I want to get some feedback from you all about where you see some of this information. And let's see, it looks like some people are seeing things and some people weren't. Where you see some of these things reflected in your work life, you know, things from like the Hofstede information, you know, power distance, individualism versus collectivism, and like Erin Meyer's scales, you know, communication, decision-making, that kind of thing. So as far as I'm concerned, feel free to unmute yourselves. We've got a couple minutes. Or just drop information into that chat if you are more comfortable with that. And after our conversation, I'll also share sort of a bibliographical information for those of you who want to see where I was pulling some of this information also. Now, let's see, I mainly work with American students in fraternity and sorority life. And so I'd love to see more information on US regional differences. Any recommendations? Michelle Gelfand does talk about some of the differences you'll see regionally. Hosta and Meyer definitely are taking a very international look at this information. But I honestly think that in looking at it and understanding that these are areas that people have differences in, that you'll see subtle differences within the United States as well. So even if they aren't per se explicitly articulated in those resources, I think that an understanding that people have high context and low context ways of communicating, that you might see that yourself, just knowing that that's something that you can be watching for, or knowing that power distance, for example, can vary across regions. I think that's another one that is very easy to see. And of course, there's other influencing factors on some of these. We can't always attribute something, you know, uncertainty avoidance to merely culture. You know, if you have anxiety, you might be very prone to avoiding uncertainty for reasons completely unrelated to culture. And that's why I sort of cautioned everyone from the beginning, these are not perfect tools, but they can be starting points for understanding things, understanding that humans are still human and they're still going to be different in different ways. It can be frustrating when someone's reactions don't line up with your own. Yeah, it takes a lot of understanding. I think what I have found so beneficial in studying intercultural communication is that when I'm having a conversation or trying to communicate with someone and I realize that we are talking at cross purposes, or I realize that there's a misunderstanding, I am less likely to be frustrated with the person, and I am more likely to take a step back and realize that there's a fundamental difference in how we are processing this information. Maybe there's another way I can state what I'm trying to do. Or if I have if I have an idea perhaps of the culture that this person is coming from, maybe I can take a step to alter how I'm doing this to try to find a kind of middle ground. So I think that a lot of the benefit in understanding and in studying intercultural communication is, in fact, the self-awareness that comes out of it, allowing you to perhaps have more fruitful discussions with people because you're coming from a place of that kind of understanding. And kind of like Erin Meyer said at the beginning of this presentation, you by understanding that culture is an influencing factor, you're not dismissing it. You're not only using your cultural lens to understand and interpret. You are accepting that there are multiple ways of doing that, and therefore you're less likely to make those judgment calls based merely on your own cultural lens.